Singularity.
My name is Nicola, and you're watching Singularity FM, the place where we interview the future. If you guys enjoy this podcast, you can show your support by either writing a review on iTunes or by becoming a patron via patreon.com/SingularityFM. Today, my guest on the show is a person whom Inc. magazine called the Oracle of Silicon Valley. Wired called him the Trend Spotter. His latest book is titled WTF, what's the future and why it's up to us. It's this fantastic book that I've been reading this weekend. And if you are curious as per how important his books might be, then let me just give you another quote that says that, quote, the internet was built on O'Reilly books. So without further ado, Tim O'Reilly, welcome to Singularity FM.
Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Thank you for being with us once again. So, Tim, if I were to ask you to introduce yourself, if someone's never heard of you and never read one of your books, and if I ask you to introduce yourself in a sentence or two, who is Tim O'Reilly?
That's a very good question, because the Tim O'Reilly that I am to myself is not necessarily the one that I am to other people. Certainly in my professional career, I guess I would say that I have been bringing the tools of learning about cutting edge technologies to Silicon Valley for the last 40 years through books, conferences, and online learning.
So I'm just trying to translate that into a one word, and if it's possible at all, bringing the words to the tools to Silicon Valley for the last 30 years. What does that make you?
Change maker.
Change agent or change maker.
Yeah, change agent. Yeah, I mean, the motto that I kind of adopted for my company is changing the world by spreading the knowledge of innovators. So you could call me a cross fertilizer or a change agent, reagent,
catalyst, maybe.
Yeah, catalyst could be.
If we're going down the chemistry path. But what's the change you're going after, be it personally or professionally then?
Yeah, I think that in one sense, I am simply expressing my own taste, as a lot of people do. I look at things and I say, oh, that's interesting to me. That's a way that the world could go that I like. I think we all do that. We try to shape our environment from the time we're babies to suit us. And I guess I have a somewhat, sort of unusual upbringing for a Silicon Valley, type, because I never took venture capital. I started my business with $500. And it was funded by customers. I've never actually had a job other than being a janitor in college or a summer job mowing lawns at Arlington National Cemetery. So I kind of made my own rules for business as I was developing my business, and the things that I find interesting are often people who are driven by curiosity, whereas there's a lot of Silicon Valley is driven by, what's the hot new thing where I can make my fortune. I've always tended to run away from that back towards the origins, where there's no money to be made yet, but it's just cool and new and interesting. And, so I've just tried to be useful in some sense by finding things that I thought, again, when I look back to the beginning of my career, I fell into a job as a technical writer. I had a friend who was a programmer who got asked to write a manual. He didn't have any idea how to do it. I thought of myself as a writer. I knew nothing about computers, but I said I'd help him out. And I learned to love computers. I fell in love in particular with regular expressions, which are text matching, tool. And and then got into Said and Awk and Pearl because they gave me what seemed like magical power over text. So I could in my career of being a writer, I had these power tools that other people didn't have, and but a lot of what we did as I started this tech writing consulting firm. And then when we didn't have work, we said, well, there's no good manual for VI, the Unix text editor, or there's no good manual for SED and awk, so we just wrote them. And so we were just in some sense, like in any open source project, they say, you scratch your own itch. We weren't doing it with open source, we were doing it with books, but we were just trying to learn and share what we learned.
And you said that you're going after aesthetic change, and yet you're trying to be useful. So does that mean that those two things overlap in your view? Because aesthetics perhaps doesn't always overlap with usefulness.
Well, yes and no. It's funny. I remember many years ago, I had a funny conversation with a woman who's now my ex-wife, but I said, I only like useful plants. I like to garden, and I do have a bias towards fruits and vegetables over flowers. And one day we were up in Ipswich, Massachusetts, and there was this miniature rose farm. And I went, oh, I love these miniature roses. I'm going to buy one. She says, I thought you only liked useful plants. And I said, it is useful. I like it. But more seriously,
but this is very serious, because Oscar Wilde famously said that art, what makes art is precisely the fact that it is mostly useless for anything else, other than perhaps aesthetics, which he didn't mention, but that's how he defined art. And he wrote this whole paper to a fan who got sort of insulted by or surprised by that kind of qualification of what art is. And yet it was not in any way intended to diminish art, but simply to separate it and distinguish it or differentiate it.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with Wilde, because to me, art is profoundly useful. It's something that helps us see the world. When you think about poetry or music or art, it sharpens our perception. It bridges the gap between things that we feel but didn't know that other people felt. And in some sense, when I see the bridge between art and utility, I'm actually thinking of a concept that Wallace Stevens, the poet, had, which is that in some sense, the worldview that we all have is an artistic creation. We are sold an idea of how the world should be. And of course, this beamed into popular consciousness a couple of years ago in Yuval Noah Harari's book, *Sapiens*.
*Sapiens*, yeah.
He tells the history of humanity as the history of, effectively, of storytelling, of lies, in some sense. The ability, he said, look, we get beyond Dunbar's number into bigger groups by creating fictions that we could all believe in, whether that's religion or the supreme leader or money. He talks about the invention of money and then the invention of debt, which is a vision of the future. These are aesthetic visions. And this is something that Stevens talked about. He has a poem called Notes Towards a Supreme Fiction, where he talks about the search for meaning is as important as the search for God. And in some sense that the reality that we construct for each other is a constructed reality.
That's very interesting, because I'm actually working on a book, my second book right now, kind of on and off, and it's called Rewriting the Human Story, How Our Story Determines Our Future.
Absolutely. And that's fundamental.
And that's my whole thesis there. That's my whole hypothesis, that a new world requires a new story to put us all together and sort of push us towards a single goal, or at least a coherent cohabitation, peaceful and coherent cohabitation without destroying the planet and so on. And we need a new story. The old stories don't fit anymore.
Oh, I'm totally with you on that. And it's funny. That's actually one of the ideas, in some ways, that runs through my book. That the point of the second part of the title, "It's Up to Us," is that what we believe and the choices we make is what ultimately shapes the future.
Let me stop you for a second, though, because I want to get to that, but in a little bit later. I want to do. I want to split our part in three parts. I want to get a little bit more to know you first. Then I want to jump into the book, which is utterly phenomenal, and I spent 3 days reading and rereading it, some parts of it, and actually, I want to get to some more general points thereafter. So, because you have very interesting education and background, as you said, and that comes from Greek and Latin, doesn't it?
That's correct.
Right? Because my education was, when I started doing this tech blog and podcast, was a philosophy, and specifically ancient Greek and Roman philosophy.
Yeah.
So Socrates, I mean Plato, Aristotle, Seneca, Cicero, Lucretius, all the classics, basically.
Well, those are all still wonderful sources of wisdom today.
So tell me, how is it that someone who had the love for Greek and Latin classics ends up in technology? And what is it that we can take from one place and bring it to the other that perhaps is lacking?
Well, there are probably two threads, and one of them relates actually to the subject of my honors thesis at Harvard, which was about mysticism and logic in Plato's dialogues. And the argument that I made was that there's certain kinds of issues in Plato that scholars, they talk in this bizarre language as if ideas only come from other people. So they're like, well, he's speaking in this mystical language about, these logical themes because he was influenced by the Orphics. And I'm like, no. When things are new, when things are fresh, they are full of mana. They're full of power, and all these things that we now rehearse 2,000 years later. The ideas of Plato and Aristotle at the time, they were ideas of enormous power and excitement, and of course you used inflated language about it. Just like, look at people talking about the internet in 1990. It's like, oh my God, it's so exciting. And there's all this overblown language about something that eventually becomes part of the everyday.
The same is now happening with cryptocurrencies, I think.
Exactly. And so there's one bridge, that here, Socrates and his circle were the Silicon Valley of Athens in 430 BC, and so people were pushing the envelope in all kinds of areas. So there's a bridge really to saying, hey, what I was interested in ancient Greece were the people at the cutting edge of the day. But there was another piece that was just sort of a pragmatic piece in my early career. And that was, because Latin and Greek are not spoken languages, you learn them by close textual reading. And when I first entered the computer field, I knew nothing. I literally saw my first computer the same day I got my first technical writing job. And I had this friend who was the programmer, and I would just ask him questions. And so I was educating myself, but I was also doing pattern recognition. And a lot of tech writing, when you're writing, manuals, is actually rewriting of, technical specs. And I was just reading them like I would read a Latin or Greek text. I was kind of just doing close reading, going, oh, this goes with that. And so I did really good work, often without fully understanding, because what I was doing was parsing. And I also remember this great experience once. I was writing some TROF macros. TROF is a typesetting language back from the early days of Unix, before desktop publishing. And Brian Kernighan had written the manual, such as it was, for TROF. And he's a very elegant, very precise writer. And and there's a concept called a trap, where you kind of you can trap on a position on the page, or you can trap on, various kinds of things. And I'm trying to read I've got some bug in my macro that I'm writing, and I just have to read what Carnahan wrote more precisely because he says exactly what he means. And I had this sort of moment of like the close reading and going, oh yeah, okay, now I got it. You know, I was, you know, I wasn't paying close enough attention to the exactitude of what he said. And of course, that runs through so many aspects of technology where, as one friend said to me, in a memorable way, he said, the skill of debugging is figuring out what you really told your computer to do instead of what you thought you told it to do. And I think in general, in our lives.
So, do you think that ethics and ancient philosophy, especially the Stoic, maybe Greek philosophy, or even Socratic dialectical methods of investigation, could help us debug technology, as it were? Because that's kind of like the whole premise of my blog, my podcast for the last 10 years.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic. I guess I would say yes, but you have to understand it properly because I don't think that most people understand the Socratic method.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they think of it as a logical exercise, and it's not. It's an exercise to find the truth. And at least in my own experience, the truth is like you're trying to build an image of the thing that you're representing, and this comes back to this aesthetic sense. You kind of have a sense of, yeah, that matches. You know, think about you know, doing a picture puzzle. You know, you're sitting there and you've got all these pieces and they don't quite fit, and then you that experience of, yes, that fits.
Mm-hmm. It reminds me to Malcolm Gladwell's idea of blink.
Yeah, yeah. In some ways, that search for truth is this mirroring where I built a model in my mind, or a sense of, yes, I have found the story that matches the reality. And I think that you know, it's very easy for people to get caught in thinking that being Socratic is manipulating the words. And that's where I'm very influenced very early in my life by general semantics. You know, Alfred Korzybski's, you know, somewhat, you know, crankish theories from the 30s, but with a great deal of truth in them that, you know, I've always loved his idea of what he called the structural differential, which is this tool that he built for people to kind of say, where are you in the process of abstracting? You know, his basic message was reality is infinite. You know, and he represented that with this parabola. You know, and he would literally say, you make this thing out of cardboard. I made one when I was a kid, and I read Science and Sanity. I was 14 years old. And, you know, you make this parabola. It's got all these little holes with strings coming down. It comes down to this circle. And the circle represents the fact that we have an experience of that infinite reality. And so there's various things that we take out of the infinite and bring down into our experience. And so we'd represent that by strings coming from these holes in the parabola. And then we have words that we use to describe it. And so often when people think about philosophy or when they think about ideas, they're simply rearranging the words.
I just had this discussion with Max Tegmark, right? Because he talks about the mathematical universe and the ultimate reality being mathematics or mathematical in nature, whereas I quoted to him Alan Watts, who says that you know, whether philosophers who live in the realm of words or mathematicians who live in the realm of numbers, because those are merely reflection or representation of real objects, they actually live by definition in the realm of illusion, whereas reality, according to Alan Watts, is this. And you can't really give it a name. I mean, you can put some mathematical formula or some kind of way to represent it, but it's not the thing. It is a representation of the thing.
Yeah, yeah. Wallace Stevens talks about this. Reality is the beginning, not the end. The naked alpha, not the Hierophant omega. He had this idea that we elaborate on reality with our words, with our stories about it. And he says, as if the midday air was thronging with the metaphysical changes that occur merely in living as and where we live. I love that we keep coming. Again, a great poem line from his poem "An Ordinary Evening in New Haven." We keep coming back and back to the real, to the hotel, and not the hymns that fall on it out of the wind. And then this one line where there's all this imagination. And he says the statues go back to being things about. Yeah.
This reminds me again to Alan Watts, who says that in a way, all poetry is trying to say what cannot be said in words.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, how can you capture love or suffering or pain or loss in words? I mean, you can try, and poets have done tremendous attempts to accomplish it, but it still only gives us a tiny glimpse. It doesn't give us the real thing.
Well, I think poetry reminds us that words are pointers.
Just like music, art, or all of those things.
Yeah, they're pointers. And people mistake them for the thing itself.
Exactly. That's so fantastic. So we only have a couple of minutes here left before I kind of transition us to talking to your book. So let me throw in a couple of quick personal questions. You were the person who set up the original meeting where the term open source was accepted and started being used from then onwards, coined by Christine Peterson, who also has been on my show before. Are you a Linux user then?
No, I came more out of the Berkeley Unix side of the Unix tradition. I mean, I have used Linux.
And today?
Today, mostly Mac. Mostly Mac.
Mostly Mac. But isn't that like kind of ironic in a way?
In what way?
Well, you helped not coin, but establish and popularize the term open source.
Yeah, I mean, but again, part of what I brought to that discussion, which I thought was important, was that I said to people, you're talking too much about Linux. It's not the only thing that, in fact, it's not the most important thing that open source has done. What I argued about was that there was this narrow political definition that had been started by Richard Stallman and the Free Software Foundation, and so Linux fit that because it was under the GPL and GCC and Emacs, and so that's what they talked about. And I said, wait a minute, over here there's this thing called the World Wide Web that was put into the public domain. You can't get freer than that. Why aren't you talking about that? And then all of the Berkeley Unix tradition, which actually, the TCP/IP that we all used to get on the early internet, came out of the Berkeley stack. I'd come to Unix, on BSD 4.1. So, I'd been around both Unix, BSD, and System 5, and I'd watched, even though AT&T, had a proprietary license, it was still this big swarming party where people brought all this stuff to the party. And I was much more on the internet side, and I was like, why are you not making the internet the heart of the open source story? And so the reason why, and of course that resonated, and it made open source much more safe. And actually bringing it back to philosophy, I've always been a huge fan of Lao Tzu, the Chinese philosopher. And in particular, there's a passage where he says, losing the way of life, men rely on goodness. Losing goodness, they rely on laws.
Wow.
And I always thought, well, the Free Software Foundation is trying to rely on laws. And I was trying to say, actually, I think open source, what we need to find is the way of life. And what I interpret that in practical terms, in a business context, not a personal, life context, but in a business context, is figuring out what really works. And so the search for me with open source, and this kind of goes back to what I said about Plato earlier, was the search for truth. And it was the search for what really drives this. And it was, okay, well, community drives it. Okay, well, it's actually the language of a network community. It's about the way that when you have a network, it's natural to share. So I was trying to search out, what was really driving this phenomenon, and then also how it would change. And of course, one of the ideas I came to was this idea that, when one thing becomes a commodity, something else becomes valuable. And that led me down the path to saying, oh, well, if the internet and open source commodify old proprietary software, something else will become valuable. And that was what led me to say, as I said in my Web 2.0 days, data is the intel inside. And, I actually kind of had this line. I said, Web 2.0 begins with collective intelligence and it ends with monopoly, with data becoming, the intel inside. And I was kind of like, if you want to be worried about freedom, that's the next battle of freedom. And sure enough, it has been. We now have vast repositories of data, and the people who have the most data are in the controlling position, and they're squeezing us in the same way that Microsoft did in its days of proprietary software. So, so again, I was just trying to find what seemed true to me.
Brilliant. So let me ask you a couple of questions about the singularity, because, of course, my show is called Singularity FM. So what's your take on the singularity and how do you define it?
I am not a singularity fan. And that's not to say that the future will not be incomprehensible to us in some ways. I do think that the fundamental idea that there could be something, a radical discontinuity. I'm not opposed to that idea. What I am opposed to, or not sold on, is the idea that we're on this inevitable and rapid path towards it.
Mm-hmm. I have an ongoing debate with Robin Hanson on that.
Yeah.
Whether we can influence the future or not. My argument was, yes, of course we can, even though it may be very hard. But if anyone, that's got to be us. And if not now, then when? His argument was kind of fluctuating between kind of it's impossible in the worst case, and in the best case, it's probably very, very hard to influence the future.
Yeah, I think it's actually people do it all the time. We all do it together, and I think it's very hard to necessarily create the effect that you want, but each of us influences the future, and some people more than others. It's very hard for me to say that when Larry and Sergey decided to create a better search engine, that they didn't influence the future. Somebody, oh well, it would have been inevitable. Somebody would have done it anyway. Maybe. There's definitely pathways that the world goes down, and you look at choices that were made. You think about World War II. Winston Churchill was asked, "What should we call this war?" And he said, "The unnecessary war." Because if they had made better choices after World War I, World War II would never have happened. We look at how we dealt with Europe after World War II, where we invested in our former enemies.
And we had the Marshall Plan.
The Marshall Plan versus what happened after the Treaty of Versailles was they basically beggared the Germans and look at our current politics.
John Maynard Keynes wrote a lot about that right after World War I, and he was a big opponent of punishing Germany so severely.
Yeah, it's totally right. And so here's an example where we made the wrong choice. And so but mainly it's just looking at history. And the biggest argument I have with singularity thinking is that because it puts this patina of inevitability on it, it takes us away from the focus that we should have on the choices that we need to make. Because if we make the wrong choices, and there's plenty of evidence that we are, that you can have the world stand still, at least on the axis you care about, for a very long time. And I actually look at, for example, the Roman history, and you got a lot was lost, and yes, there were new things that were discovered. The Middle Ages were not entirely the Dark Ages, and there were great social changes. But for example, The Hagia Sophia in Istanbul was the largest building in the world for 1,000 years. They didn't get any better at it, and that's a long time in human timescales. So what if that were, so I imagine some pretty possible dark futures where, and actually I wrote a piece once about climate change and Fermi's paradox, and it was not that, necessarily humanity goes extinct, which is also a possibility, but simply we could have a dark age from which it's very hard to recover because we have used all the cheap energy and we can get back up to the Victorian level, but we can't get to the level of energy intensity that would let us, rediscover and recreate digital computers, for example. So we could have the Victorian internet, but we couldn't have the, in some far future, because, hey, we've depleted all the easy, energy, and we just can't build an energy intensive civilization again. Now, it's not impossible, but, that you go down another path, but it's just, there's a lot of pathways that could lead us, in very different directions. And this idea that we're on this inevitable march to some, progress. I mean, look at evolutionary history. I mean, I think it's clear that it's not a tale of progress. It's a tale of change.
And that's exactly where I think ethics comes in, because you see, I agree entirely with you, and which is the whole purpose and reason why I started doing what I do, is because my whole so we have this kind of indirect debate with Peter Diamandis. So Peter says that there is all of humanity's grand challenges and all of the problems we face can be solved by two things, he says. One is the proper application of technology, and the other is capital, which in my books is another technology, because money was invented by us, and it's a kind of technology that we use to allocate resources. So basically, he says, with the right technology, to simplify it, you can accomplish anything. My claim is technology is necessary, but it's not sufficient. It's not enough, because look at everything. I mean, we have all the resources to solve, or we know how to address, or at least start addressing global warming today, but we're not doing it. We have all the resources to stop throwing plastic in the oceans, but we're not doing it, and all of those things. So it's not just technology and it's not just capital. That's been my claim. Whereabouts do you line on that debate?
Oh, I'm very much with you. I think fundamentally, we need to be, we need an ethical revolution as much as anything. We need to actually understand how to, we've developed enormous capabilities, and we have to figure out how to use them to make a great society. And I think, if you look at history, there are periods that are wonderful flowerings, and then there are periods that are pretty dark. And it's actually interesting. I read a really interesting piece by Freeman Dyson recently.
I interviewed George some time ago.
Yeah, well, if you ever get a chance to interview Freeman, what an interesting mind. But he wrote this review of Geoffrey West's book about scale. And he started out with what seemed like an odd little side note about genetic drift versus selective pressure, right? And it was just really the idea that actually in smaller communities, you have a higher mutation rate, because they concentrate. And so he just kind of throws that away. And then he kind of goes through Jeffrey's whole thing about why scale is better. And there's this sort of bigger and bigger cities. And, and he said, well, look, actually, if you look at the great fertile periods of human history, you look at ancient Athens, or you look at Florence in the Renaissance, or you look at early America, they were actually fairly concentrated populations. And it's actually, and then it kind of comes back to this idea of genetic drift in small populations, because that's where you get this sort of incredible variation that accelerates. And so here was this view from evolutionary biology that would also kind of apply to, some of these ideas, as we build, to a civilization of global scale, do we in fact eliminate one of our sources of innovation, which is what people do in isolated, subcultures that are cut off.
Out of necessity.
Yeah, and if I look at my career, it's been around finding these isolated communities. It was like nobody thought the PC was going to be a big thing. All the people who were in the computer industry. I remember Ken Olson from Digital Equipment Corporation. The PC is a toy. And then here's the world of Windows, and they didn't get the internet, and the internet was brought to us by a bunch of people who were just doing it for the love of it. And you look at the way the crypto community just sort of got over the edge. All the people who are doing synthetic bio are not the kind of the mainstream of, so or AI, where the deep learning guys were off in their corner and nobody was taking them seriously until suddenly. And the question is, are we creating a society with that kind of innovative potential? Is one question. But the other is, are we creating a society that doesn't tear itself apart through, inequality? Because you can have, a society that's a science and technology and economic powerhouse that's a shit show. I mean, look at Nazi Germany. They were, they were the kind of, here was this, terrible economy that leading to this, dictatorship, while they were also the scientific leader of the world. And, they actually drove out a lot of their scientists, which made it go somewhere else. Oh, you're doing that now.
Einstein was shocked and disgusted how some of his smartest colleagues basically became obsessed German nationalists almost overnight, and didn't see any trouble switching from their work to, say, producing weapons of mass destruction, like mustard gas or chemical weapons, and so on and so on. Which again goes to my point that ethics is kind of like an operating system that we need to install all over our civilization. But let me, and I just sort of to let you know where I'm coming from in it. I started this show 10 years ago almost as a Singularity fanboy. And as time kind of went through, I started deeper and deeper into this. I started becoming more and more critical and starting sort of getting back to the roots and to the sort of Socratic sort of ways of investigation, and seeing that, we're limiting ourselves if we stick only to sort of the technology realm, and ethics can so much to offer us. Perhaps, so let me use this as a segue to your book. I enjoyed reading this book tremendously this weekend. It's a phenomenal book. It's pretty substantial too. So let's start with the title and break it into two parts or three parts. First, WTF. WTF, Tim.
What the fuck? So WTF is an expression that people use in two ways. And probably the dominant way is WTF, that's not okay, But they also have a WTF that's like, whoa, that's amazing. That's unbelievable. And so we see both in technology. And one of the themes that I try to run through the book, and actually I kind of switch from the WTF metaphor to the unicorn story via a wonderful passage from Tom Stoppard, the playwright, where he talks about a unicorn, and you first see it and it's magical. And the more people see it, the more commonplace it becomes, until it becomes as thin as reality. And you go, well, that is exactly what happens with unicorns. I was talking with Keller Ronaudo, the CEO of Zipline, recently, and he said, like their drone deliveries of blood and medicine in Rwanda are kind of commonplace. People used to be, oh my God, what's that? They see this drone flying overhead and dropping a parachute, and now they kind of expect that's how you deliver blood and medicine. It's just like that's how it works. And you think about, back, 100 and, 30, 40, whenever they were first, like Buffalo was the city of light. It was Silicon Valley. It was WTF. What is that? What are these shining things? it's not whale oil. It's something else. What is it? It's magic. Now it's like, it's cheap. It's something we take for granted. And I think in some sense, we're actually, when I think about Silicon Valley, I think, we will be Buffalo or Detroit at some point. People will go, oh yeah, remember when Silicon Valley was a big thing? And the future will be happening somewhere else.
That's why I'm so concerned when we have this kind of wholesale effort right now, in my view, trying to export Silicon Valley all over the world and make everyone else copy and paste the Silicon Valley model. In my view, I actually wrote a piece some time ago called "Why Politics is the Future of Technology and Technology is the Future of Politics," and there I argued that basically, Silicon Valley has a lot more to learn than to give the world, in my opinion, because if we follow their idea that all we need is the best technology and capital, Silicon Valley has the largest number of both billionaires and endless technology. And yet it doesn't seem to help. Like when I was traveling through California, I was shocked by the wholesale poverty I was seeing everywhere. There's people camping there today, just like people were camping in the Great Depression, but by the thousands, sometimes maybe tens of thousands. I was shocked. And you look at environment, you look at social cohesion, you look at the rates of crimes, clearly that didn't help. But there are other places in the world which have a lot less technology and a lot less capital, and yet you don't seem to find those kinds of problems there. So, in my opinion, clearly, it's not the case that technology and capital solve everything. They're very necessary, they're required, but they're not sufficient.
I 100% agree.
And which is kind of ironic because California is called the Golden State, and yet if you actually technically it's like the 11th poorest state in the United States, but if you actually take the cost of living into consideration, it becomes the poorest state in the United States actually, because when you compare just numbers per numbers, it's number 11, but if you live in the middle of Missouri or Alabama or something, the cost of living is nothing like in San Francisco, obviously. So once you take price comparison, then it becomes by far the poorest state, which I think is shameful and horrible. That's why I'm so shocked and scared that people trying to bring Silicon Valley here in Canada, for example. That worries me, to be honest with you. So anyway, so let's talk about the second part of your title, or the subtitle. What's the future and why it's up to us? Let's break it into two parts. What's the future, Tim?
Well, it's funny because in some ways the title of the book is probably deceptive, because the book really isn't about what's the future. It's really much more about how to think about the future, and how to see it in the present.
Because maybe the future is a process rather than a place.
That's right. And I've read a lot of books where somebody prognosticates to say this will happen, this will happen, this will happen. And that's not really what I try to do. What I really try to do is to say, here are things that are happening today, and you can ask yourself, what happens if this goes on? So it's really about identifying vectors that you can kind of see the line. This is going here, this is going here. And the future is the sum of a lot of vectors. And it's really about how do we recognize those things earlier. I love the phrase from William Gibson, which I think I've probably been the chief popularizer of. I think he said it once on a radio program. I heard it and started quoting it. And now everybody kind of uses it all the time, which is the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed yet. And, so often, like when you think about the World Wide Web, when we first started writing about it in 1992, there were 200 websites. But those of us who were there in the early web were already living in the future. It just wasn't obvious to everybody that that was the future yet.
Yeah, you had the first commercial website, we should add, or I should add for my audience who may not know that.
When Google, I still remember, when Google was taking off, and I was like, wow, we really got to start publishing books on how Google operates, and all these things about big data and all the stuff about the sort of operations that they do inside of, these vast. I never thought, well, Google's a unique case. Everybody doesn't have to do that. It's just a specialized. And it's like, no, this is the future. And of course, you look around and you say, well, right now there are people who are doing genetic engineering, and George Church is very definitely living in the future. And we're going to look back and go, wow, why did we not take that more seriously? There were a bunch of people saying, could we bring extinct species back to life? Could we generate new human brain tissue for, fixing people with Parkinson's? Could we, do germline editing? I believe, back to the singularity, I think, if there's far more chance of a biological singularity than there is of a digital singularity. Just as a for instance, where we engineer ourselves into a different species.
Absolutely, yeah. And this is one of the questions that I've been investigating, which is the very meaning of what it is to be human. Because my argument has been that technology is a magnifying mirror. It's amoral until you apply it, then becomes either moral or immoral. And it's a mirror because it doesn't have an essence of its own. It merely reflects whatever it is that we project in it. But it's not a perfect mirror because it has this amplification, its magnification effect. And if there's one thing that's for sure is that there's always unintended consequences, which makes it so much trickier. But going back to George Church, I interviewed him here on the podcast, and I gave him the criticism of Francis Fukuyama, who said that transhumanism is the most dangerous idea in the world. And George Church's response was that inactivity and complacency were the most dangerous ideas. Just like assuming that doing nothing would keep you safe and protected is the most dangerous idea in his view.
Yeah, I'm with George.
So let's go back again to your book, though. In a way, you say that you agree with me that the future is more of a process than a place, and it's not inevitable. But what are the major trends or people at the fringes that you pay attention to and that we should be paying attention to, other than George Church, perhaps?
Well, I think the things that I think are going to shape our future more than we have grokked yet, climate change is far and away at the top of the list. And whether you take the most alarmist, possibilities of climate change, or whether you just take where we are today, this idea that it has to be utterly catastrophic or business as usual, I think misses the point. I recently met a couple of classicists, actually. There's been a revolution in classical archaeology through science. Professor Mike McCormick at Harvard, Malcolm Weiner, who's actually kind of an independent, former currency trader who's taken his fortune and funded archaeology for the last 40 years. They've been researching the connection between climate change and the fall of ancient Aegean civilizations, climate change and the fall of Rome. And it's astonishing, and let's go to the work on the fall of Rome. Turns out there were 3 volcanic eruptions within 10 years that led to this very, very cold period. That's what led the migration of the Huns, who brought with them bubonic plague, right? So you have the plague of Justinian, basically, and you have Rome, the fall of Western Rome. Rome goes from 1 million people to 50,000 people over that period. So and it was sort of like, again, you think about, if you've read 1491 and the speculation about what happened to the Native Americans when the diseases came, and so you look at effectively the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. You had a climate event which put enormous economic pressure. Justinian had stored up 10 years worth of grain, wasn't enough. You have then mass migrations and warfare. You have plague, and you go, well, we could have that same thing. You could make the case that, in fact, people have made the case that climate played a role. The big drought in Syria, that led to something that was one more contributing factor in the warfare, leading to these migrations, which are destabilizing Europe, pushing America in the direction of fascism, and protectionism. that's just the tip of the iceberg. What happens when there's not just 10 million people trying to move because where they're living is not so great, but it's 100 million people? We're not prepared for that even remotely, and it will take enormous foresight, enormous forethought for our civilization to get through intact and in a recognizable form. That doesn't mean that people won't survive. I mean, in the case of Rome, the Eastern Roman Empire lasted for another 1,000 years.
Until the 1450s, I think.
Yeah, exactly, which is sort of astonishing. But it became very different. And certainly there was a renewal in the West. It didn't, you look at the changes that happened. They were not, they didn't last forever. And we built, humans, kind of rediscover and rebuild. But it's much more cyclical. And if we're really going to, I think we need to be far more proactive. And so I think about things like how are we going to turn climate refugees into settlers? How are we going to say, what will we really do if we were trying to resettle 10 million people instead of, well, we'll let in 10,000 and try to integrate them into our society, and the rest of them are going to be parked somewhere. What would we do if we, there's already been there's huge areas of the continental U.S. that, for example, that are relatively depopulated, and you kind of go, could we in fact be proactive and say we're going to do something about that? Because there's probably 10 million people who would say, well, we can come settle that area. It'll be hard, but we'll be settlers. And for all the things that are horrible about Israel, came and did that, by ejecting the people who were there, previously. But that idea, they basically took a refugee population and turned them into settlers and built a prosperous society. And I go, could we do that without, a mass migration? Again, going back to archaeology and this data, it's not just climate data that they've got from ice cores, there's also genetic data. And one of the things, you look at history, they've now found that the people of Stonehenge, through genetic analysis, there's a point where all of the males were killed, right? That's what happened in ancient history. You'd have this mass migration, and somebody would win, and all the men were killed, and they took the women, and they built, they go, okay, we've moved into the land that's good. And a lot of those migrations were triggered by climate events. Mm-hmm. So anyway, it's sort of interesting. So that's one piece. That's sort of the dark side. On the plus side, I think that there's a wonderful set of possibilities in the systems that we are building. And this is a thread that runs through my book, and I've been continuing to develop and think about. And that is, when you look at a vast algorithmic system like what Google has done with search, or Facebook is doing with its social networking, or our financial markets. These are vast network systems that represent digitally mediated, composite organisms made up of millions or billions of human beings. It's kind of this idea that I've been really exploring for the last 20 years. Is like, we're building a global brain. And that brain can do things that we could not do before. And there's a phrase I heard recently or a sentence that I heard recently from a guy named Paul Cohen. He's a former DARPA program manager, who's now the head of he's the dean of the School of Information Sciences at the University of Pittsburgh. And we were both at a session on AI at the National Academies. And he said something that I wrote down and I've been quoting ever since. He said, the opportunity for AI is to help humans model and manage complex interacting systems. And we can do that. And there are people who are starting to work on this. Carla Gomez at Cornell, was a professor there. She started something called the Institute for Computational Sustainability. And they're doing amazing work around taking more factors into account. So they're working with the Brazilian power company. Which tributary of the Amazon should you dam? You don't just look at economic factors, like, well, how much power do you want to generate? Turns out that where you cite it, if you take into account enough factors, like species, being damaged, people forced to move, you can actually have a better economic outcome, and you can generate more power at lower cost. You just basically have to do more math. Just in the same way that Google built a better search engine by doing more math, where they could take more factors into account.
But isn't that what Yuval Noah Harari calls dataism? And he even says that it's a new religion. That's basically the idea that with enough data, we can solve any problem. And it's all just a matter of data.
No, I don't think I don't buy that, because of course data is just a tool. Can we model and manage more complex systems? That's kind of like saying, well, oh my God, airplanes, that's just dataism, but actually when we figured out the airflows over wings and did the math, we were able to build better airplanes. I'm sorry, math as a way of understanding the world, and data as a way of understanding the world lets us model and manage things that we couldn't do before.
No, there's no debate about that. But the point is how exactly you're applying. So, for example, if you're talking about airplanes, if you send those fantastic airplanes to World War II afterwards, then your math is kind of besides the point. It's more detrimental.
Of course, but I mean, the point is that what I'm saying, we have these tools. Can we point them at the right problems?
And that maybe cannot be directed by data, or can it?
Of course not. No, that is in fact, that comes back to the earlier part of our conversation. That comes from our aesthetic and moral vision, and that's kind of the why it's up to us part of my title.
Mm-hmm. That's what I'm pushing towards.
Yeah, the choices we make about how to use the technology, the superpowers that we're developing for ourselves, are critical. If we use those simply to enrich a small number of people, with this sort of, really, we have a story that says, the Peter Diamandis story, like if you have enough technology and you have enough capital, it'll sort of trickle down. Well, no, it doesn't trickle down naturally. You have to actually design a system to take more factors into account. And that's, again, part of what I've been trying to do is, since I wrote the book, I've been trying to do further research on two-sided markets and, big internet marketplaces, and going, okay, how do we make them more robust? Well, we make them more robust by taking the needs of all the stakeholders into account.
Well, let me even go a little deeper on this second part, why it's up to us, because this is also where I entirely agree with you, but also I have this debate with Robin Hanson, who is this tremendous economist who wrote The Age of M, and he argues that influencing the future is at best super very hard. What do you respond to that? Why is it up to us? I mean, he would say only a 1% of a 1% of a 1% maybe can do something, right? Because my argument against his book was like, look, Robin, in my opinion, things can be a lot worse than you describe them, or they can be a lot better. And it all depends on what we're going to do now. And his response is, no, this is how it's going to be, because if you look at the trends and the way things play out, it's not going to be at one extreme end or the other. The economics says it's going to be here. And most of us, it's very hard to influence the future. What do you say to that?
I say that economic determinism is probably the cardinal sin of the present moment. I look, and it's funny because my book is about technology, but it is about historical choices. And for example, I cite the high school movement, which started, bottom up. It was, high school in America started like the open source movement. It was like some people who said, we want to do this thing. Like our kids, are not going to be on the farm anymore. We got to educate them for the jobs of the future. And it was a movement. It wasn't like some government, decided, I think it started in Massachusetts, but then it really took hold in Iowa, which at the time was actually the richest state in the country. I didn't know that. And so in 1909, 9% of eligible age kids went to high school, to the equivalent of high school. It was an elite pursuit. And by 1939, it was 70%. So over 30 years, it was this movement that just kind of like, oh, we're going to actually tax ourselves and build schools. That's why school districts are funded locally, because it was a local grassroots movement. And I go, so here's this amazing story of people collectively deciding to make a choice that would affect the future.
And we had the New Deal also, and so on.
Yeah, well, that was more the New Deal is more of the model that we're kind of familiar with government, which is led at the national level, top down. But the high school movement really was a bottom up local movement, and that's really I think quite wonderful. And you look at the many movements that are started by one person, and then another person joins them, and then another. And you look at the civil rights movement. This was a struggle. It was a lot of people working towards it. You don't think that changed the future?
I personally do, and I actually think that people like you, personally and professionally, have a very good history that shows that it's possible and that it has been done. And if you look around us, actually, good thing about Silicon Valley is there's a few people like you there who have made an impact or a dent in the universe, as Steve Jobs used to say.
Yeah.
So I think it's possible, and those are the kinds of people we want, and we just want them to be caring not about perhaps clicks and sort of Wall Street money, but about a grander, longer-term vision, in my view.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so I think we have to believe that we can affect the future. We have to believe it, because if we don't believe it, we don't act. And there's a poem that I'm very, very fond of from Rainer Maria Rilke called "The Man Watching," and this is not an exact quote, but I feel I can take. I read it in Robert Bly's translation, and then I've kind of modified it somewhat. I figure it's not the original anyway. So, but it's talking about the wrestlers of the Old Testament, Jacob among them, wrestling with angels, and they know they can't win, And Rilke says, what we fight with is so small, and when we win, it makes us small. What we want is to be defeated by successively greater beings. and I love that because, we struggle with, it's like you think about the typical Silicon Valley startup that's, they talk about, well, we're going to change the world, but really it's about getting to the exit. It's like what we fight with is so small, and when we win, it makes us small. I think of Jeff Hammerbacher's great quote, the best minds of my generation are teaching people to click on ads. And I think that's kind of a waste. Yeah, I forget exactly what the last part of it was.
I know I went to this meeting that I told some tech geeks that if they end up working for Facebook, I'd be ashamed of myself if I did that, being so smart as they were. And they were looking at me like, that was their dream. They just want to go work for Facebook. And I was like, for what? What amazing thing are they doing? And I mean, look at the elections. Look at all of that. Do you want to be a part of that machine? And
I think at this point, fixing Facebook is work that matters.
Fixing it is work that matters. But can a new sort of employee do that kind of job?
Yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting question. But in any event, I mean, I do think that there's by the way, somebody who you should have on your podcast is a guy named Anand Jared Haridas. He's got a new book coming out in September, I think, or maybe it's August, but it's called "Winners Take All: The Elite Charade of Changing the World." And his basic point is that and it's really in some ways a refutation of what you were saying earlier from Peter Diamandis, uh, which is we have created a world of profound inequality, and we're going to have to actually make some deeper changes. You can't just give back while continuing to do the things that have caused the problem in the first place. And it's not just inequality. So you think about climate change. We can't, go on as we are and just kind of tweak it around the edges. Now, I do think there's a lot that can be done with technology, but in the end, we are going to have to reinvent our civilization. And we are, back to the book that you're working on, we are going to have a new vision of how the world could work. There's another book I love right now, Kate Raworth's Donut Economics, where she's talking about this idea that we have this idea of growth that always goes up and to the right. And she's like, no, actually, the right way to think about economics is that there's a habitable zone. It's kind of like the Earth is in a habitable zone. She doesn't use that. But
the Goldilocks.
The Goldilocks zone. But, in economics terms, there's economic undershoot. People don't have enough to eat. They don't have access to opportunity. They don't have healthcare. They don't have shelter. And on the other side is economic overshoot, climate change, species loss, et cetera, et cetera. This is the job of economics is to help keep us in the donut. And I actually see that also in Silicon Valley. Microsoft didn't stay in the donut. Because they were pursuing growth at all costs. At some point when the growth of the PC market slowed, they consumed the ecosystem. They basically took all the vitality out of the market. Now Google's doing that to the web, becoming increasingly monopolistic. One of the things I've been looking at since I wrote the book, I've been going through Google's financial statements, for example, and in 2004 when they went public, half of their revenue came from advertising on third-party websites. It's now down to 18%. Because more and more services are delivered directly through Google, and and you look at that and you go, if you think long term, you can see Google is getting out of the donut.
They want to be the web.
Yeah, and the fact is,
just like Facebook.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that there's a really interesting point because, like if there were a model that said, well, there's a model of growth that's let's expand the habitable zone, right? That would be actually a really useful model where you go, yes, you can grow, but only if it expands the habitable zone. Anyway, back to business case studies of donut economics gone awry. Uber took their drivers for granted. That became a bigger and bigger cost on the system because they weren't just an unlimited supply. They were allocating too much of the value to passengers and to themselves, in order to drive their valuation. And drivers were kind of a disposable resource until they weren't. And that's kind of again a case of getting out of the donut. And I think that we have to figure out how to do growth that is robust and organic and takes many factors into account.
Let me just grab that thought, and then I want to come back to the Google and Facebook examples. But if one thing that you convinced me here among many with your book is that I actually installed the Lyft app on my phone after reading your book. I've never used Uber for a number of ethical reasons that I don't want to go into right now to waste time, but you actually cover some of those reasons in your book. So I want to ask you to explain to us two things. First, what is Uber as a platform? And second, how is Lyft better or at least different than Uber, which is the reason why I actually decided, well, I'm going to give this a try, and I installed Lyft on my phone.
Well, let me qualify it. Since I wrote the book, obviously there's been a change in leadership at Uber. And I think they are becoming
by force.
Yes, of course. But they are becoming more like Lyft now in the sense that they really are working very hard to actually do a better job with their drivers. And I don't know that, at the time I wrote the book, there was a pretty stark choice. I mean, Travis was, definitely
I was not a fan. Let me just say that.
Yeah. He may be a great entrepreneur, but if that's what we get from our entrepreneurs, that's not the world I want to live in. And I do think that the company is acting much more ethically. It's not to say that there aren't challenges. Uh,
So what is Uber as a platform?
so here's the thing that I think about these on-demand platforms is they teach us something very important about the future of work. Several things, and that's why I make them so central to the book. First off, they teach us that we're increasingly in a world where humans and machines are working in concert. And you could say, well, a taxi cab driver is a human and a machine working in concert. They're driving, they're driving a car. Okay, but I'm talking about the digital dispatch. So here is this system which allows us to summon a car on demand, to any location. And it's a marketplace. You have to have enough people on both sides of the market for it to work. So there's a big sort of, there's a heavy lift to build up this network marketplace. And so this idea of a network marketplace mediated by technology is a design pattern that allows us to actually get more work done than the old model, which was, well, we'll have a limited supply only in the locations that are densest. And we'll basically have these little geographic regions. Well, now we have this network which allows us to do something that we couldn't do before. And that same network, for example, is that the same principles are now being used, for example, by Zipline to deliver blood and medicine in countries around the world, right? So it's literally not just about transportation, it's what else you can do with it. And then the other thing that's so important in the Uber and Lyft story is the worker is an augmented worker. The app actually is sort of a cognitive augmentation to the driver. To be a taxi driver before the age of Uber and Lyft, you had to do a lot of learning. You had to learn your way around. Every once in a while you get a taxi cab driver who's leafing through the Rand McNally Atlas trying to figure out where that street was that you asked for. But mostly they spent, a year, and in the case of the black cabbies in London, it's a 3-year training, which literally changes the brains of the taxi cab drivers. They become like Frank Herbert's mentats. They literally could do turn-by-turn directions between any 2 points in London. You don't have to do that anymore. The app does that for you. And that, to me, is a profound message about the future possibilities of partnerships between humans and machines. And so the restructuring of industries that becomes possible. Right now, and again, this is why the bridge between Uber and Zipline is so interesting, because in Rwanda, you don't have well-developed hospital infrastructure. There's a lot of places in the US where you don't too. When I lived in Sebastopol in Sonoma County, the hospital closed. There wasn't enough demand. But here's this technology which lets you have smaller clinics distributed around the country with all the benefits of access to what you need. You can drop in those blood supplies. You need some specialized, Rh negative blood. Bang, here it is, 15 minutes. And now you think about, add in, this cognitive augmentation. You can imagine a totally decentralized healthcare system with small neighborhood clinics, with telemedicine, with access to experts, and that kind of, and that's not the only place where you can imagine that. So you could imagine a very different economy matching up opportunity with needs, with people, with resources in a much more effective way.
And that's brilliant. That's utterly brilliant, and to be commended. But now, in terms of the implication of that theoretical idea, you have two examples. One is the Uber examples with all its history and baggage and sort of ideology, if you will, even. And then you have the Lyft example. So tell me why Lyft is a little different than Uber. What makes them different?
Well, I think the origin story of the two companies, I think, is fairly critical. The origin story of Uber was two rich guys. They were already successful serial entrepreneurs who, couldn't get a taxi. They wanted to, so they wanted to summon a black car on demand. In fact, Garrett Camp, who really came up with the idea, had been basically hacking the limousine system by he would call multiple cars, and then whichever one came first, he would take, and then he would just, he had a long list of black car number drivers, fairly kind of, unethical routes,
selfish,
very entitled routes. And it was fortunate because by starting in the black car market, they did figure some things out. They avoided the regulation because it's regulated differently. There was no street hail to compete with. Taxi Magic, which had come earlier, had gotten all caught up in the knots of sort of trying to replicate the taxi experience, whereas this just sort of bypassed that. But Lyft started from, we want to reinvent public transportation. They were inspired by the jitneys, and despite the fact that they started with a company called Zimride, which is not named after John Zimmer, the co-founder with Logan Green, but after the jitneys in Zimbabwe that they'd seen, which were just these crowdsourced, public transit. And they had been trying to do that, and then they saw what Sunil Paul was doing with Sidecar. So he was actually the real visionary of this. He actually did a patent back in 2002, I think it was, for all the things that sort of showed up in Uber and Lyft. But he was too early, and so he decided it wasn't doable. And then after Uber started doing it, he kind of started Sidecar up, but he didn't raise enough capital. And then Lyft saw what he was doing and went, wow, this is great. And they basically rolled out the peer-to-peer car sharing, spun Lyft out of what had been Zimride. And then Travis eventually came about a year later to the peer-to-peer model as opposed to just the black car model, what we now call UberX. And so the roots in public transportation versus elite transportation, I think, were part of that split originally. I think now under Dara, I think the values of the two companies are much closer aligned, and I think that they're both struggling with the curse of what in the book I call super money. This basically they've created this enormous valuation based on promises of world domination, and that means that they have to basically show growth. They have to show improving economics, and they become a slave to what in some ways is the hostile AI that rules our society, which is shareholder value. It's this imperative. You must increase growth, you must increase profits, you must increase shareholder value, even if it means that humans are a cost to be eliminated. And I worry about that, despite, while Lyft has always tried to be more driver friendly, both companies are now, in this race that's really a race to get their capital scorecard as high as possible. And I often think, how different would this market be if there had not been this furious Silicon Valley capital race? It's certainly possible that it would never have gotten to scale. And that is something that capital is very good at. You look at the way Amazon, used capital to get scale, and Uber and Lyft have really used capital to build this vast two-sided marketplace with sufficient supply of riders and passengers. But if it had grown organically, might there be a much more egalitarian system where drivers were, much better compensated, and we have a system. Actually, there's a wonderful book which I encountered after I wrote mine. I made a throwaway comment in my book where I said one day, future economic historians will look back, wryly on this period when we believe in the divine right of capital, while looking back on our ancestors who believed in the divine right of kings.
Cory Doctorow.
Yeah.
Is that not a quote from Doctorow?
No, that's a quote from my book.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But what was interesting was somebody wrote to me and said, have you read Marjorie Kelly's book, The Divine Right of Capital? And I hadn't. I never heard of it. It was written in 2001. And it's a wonderful book because she talks about the concept that I took from it that was most powerful was she talked about the way that the right of capital is sort of embedded in the way we read our financial statements. She says, look, the fundamental equation of a profit and loss statement is profit equals revenue minus expenses. Well, let's expand the expenses part of it. There's cost of materials, there's cost of labor, and there's cost of capital. And then we rewrote the equation so that profit equaled return to capital. Why didn't we say profit equals return to capital plus return to labor plus return to materials, which of course is the triple bottom line when you think about it. And you go, wouldn't you want the return to be proportional to the actual value that you receive from each of those inputs? Why would it all go to capital? And of course, there's cases where capital deserves its return. I mean, Amazon would not exist without having raised enormous amounts of capital. On the other hand, Google didn't need that much capital. They started being relatively profitable relatively early. Apple, needed a capital infusion late in their life. Microsoft kind of kept them alive because they needed them for antitrust purposes, and then they kind of became a monster. But at this point, capital gives nothing to Apple. Apple gets its money from customers and is actually giving it to capital, despite the fact that capital hasn't actually invested in the company in 20 years.
Tim, we unfortunately, our time flew by so quickly, and I can keep you here for another hour and a half, and I haven't even gone through a third of my questions, but we only have a couple of minutes left. So let me ask you, if you were to summarize the thesis of your book in a sentence, what's the thesis?
Well, unfortunately, there's not one thesis. It's like a layer cake. There are really four parts to the book, and in some sense, I could have written four books. The first book is very much on how to think about the future, and a set of techniques for recognizing the future in the present. The second part of the book is really about the nature of platforms and the nature of business today. And this is setting up really the second half of the book, which is the part that really probably, if I do have a summary of, and it is that we are basically living in a world ruled by vast algorithmic systems. And we can see how those algorithmic systems can go right, and we can see how they can go wrong. And the way that they go wrong is very similar to what people have described in their fears of AI, where Nick Bostrom's famous paperclip maximizer, I actually prefer Elon Musk's version, which is the self-improving strawberry picking robot that eventually decides that humans are in the way of strawberry fields forever, because it's got a cute cultural reference in it. This idea of the runaway objective function. You told this machine to do something, and it does it even though it's no longer actually achieving what you would logically say. We gave it the wrong instructions. And so the core message of the book is that our algorithmic systems often, have what you could call the genie problem. We had our three wishes, we gave them, and we didn't phrase them quite right, and the machine went awry. That's another way of describing this paperclip maximizer problem. And so we can see how Google mostly got search quality right. YouTube and Facebook have not, right? They basically have algorithms that are really running amok, radicalizing people, driving people to conspiracy theories.
I wish I can tell you what happened to me today on one of my videos that I shot with my own cameras, but I don't have the time, but it was horrendous. And
yeah. And so I try to establish that, how algorithms go wrong, in the third part of the book. And then the fourth part of the book is really, and guess what? Our financial systems and our economy are ruled by the same kind of rogue algorithm with the wrong objective function. And so ultimately, the book is an argument from technology about the economy and the failure of our financialized economy to address real human needs. And so effectively, I'm making the case is just as computer platforms can go wrong if you give your machine the wrong instructions, we are living in an economic machine that is ruled by the wrong algorithm, and we need to rewrite the algorithm.
Mm-hmm. I actually made a speech in Rotterdam once called "The Emperor Has No Clothes." Socrates Deconstruct Singularity University, where I argued precisely about that the underlying algorithm is deterministic in the sense that it provides certain kinds of outcomes, that where you have the best intentioned people in the world serving the wrong structure, the wrong algorithm. So instead of innovating at the algorithm or systemic level, they're preoccupied algorithm at the innovating at the margins, and in the end, the outcome is marginal.
You're so right. We're clearly thinking along the same lines. We have got to reinvent the world more profoundly than we have been doing yet. And that's ultimately, I think, what we should all be engaged in. We have a new set of capabilities. We need to say, what could we do if we were starting fresh, if we wanted to make a better world? How would we do it?
We write a new story. We write a new story that we unite behind, and then we go creating it.
I think you're absolutely right. That is absolutely the challenge of the 21st century. We have to write a new story.
I'm trying to write it now too, but it's not about me. So let me ask you, where can people find more about you and your work?
Well, my professional, my business is O'Reilly.com. This basically, books, conferences, online learning. I've got a site called WTFeconomy.com that sort of collects information, related to the book and these themes of technology and the economy. It's also we have a weekly newsletter, the Next Economy newsletter, which you can sign up for. And if you go to nexteconomy.com, you'll find that there. I'm Tim O'Reilly on Twitter. You can find me around lots of places.
Tim, you've been really generous with us, giving us 90 minutes of your time, and I'm very grateful for that. But we touched on so many things, and there are a few things that I couldn't touch on, things like hybrid AI and symbiogenesis, those ideas that are highly pertinent to my audience. So I recommend everybody reads your book to find out what those two things mean. But if you were to wrap up our conversation today and send us away with a single message, what would that be?
Work on stuff that matters.
Tim O'Reilly, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this.
If you guys enjoyed this show, you can help me make it better in a couple of ways. You can go and write a review on iTunes, or you can simply make a donation.